The results are now in from one of the most important German elections in years. The Social Democrats narrowly took first place, with just over a quarter of the popular vote. But that's not enough to put them in power, and the painful process of coalition building must now begin. The Economist's editor-in-chief, Zanny Minton-Beddoes, is joined by Berlin bureau chief Tom Nuttall and Jörg Lau, Dietz Heit's foreign policy coordinator, to discuss what the election results mean for the future of Germany.
The departure of Chancellor Merkel in itself is a pretty momentous event for Germany and indeed for Europe. But the results of this election will change a lot, or will they? What will they mean for Germany? What will they mean for Europe? And what are the wider implications for the rest of the world? With me to discuss this are Tom Nuttall, our Berlin bureau chief, and Jörg Lau, foreign policy editor at Die Zeit, a leading German weekly. Thank you both for joining us. So, Tom, you look remarkably well for someone who I guess has not had that much sleep in the last 24 hours. But why don't you start with the facts? Because for most people outside Germany, at least, German election results are pretty baffling. So just tell us what has happened and then we'll go on to what we should make of it.
This came down to a two-horse race, really, between the conservative Christian Democratic bloc, Angela Merkel's party, and the Social Democrats. And of course, these parties already ruled together in a grand coalition in Germany. The results, the preliminary result that we got this morning put the SPD, the Social Democrats, about 1.6 percentage points ahead of the Union, CDU-CSU. That's going to convert to about 10 seats in the Bundestag. So it's close. It's very close. We also have a lot of political fragmentation that means that the next coalition is almost certainly going to have to consist of three parties. This is the first time that would have happened since the 1950s. So what we've been seeing today is a lot of sort of jostling for position, party leaders and other functionaries trying to position themselves for what are going to be some pretty difficult talks in the weeks ahead. But at this stage, and there's still a long way to go, I think you'd say it's clearly advantage for the SPD, advantage for Olaf Scholz, who's their candidate for the Chancellery. He's also the current finance minister. He's much more personally popular than Armin Laschet, his conservative rival. There's a strong narrative that's really sort of taken hold today of the CDU-CSU having had a disastrous campaign, worst result in their history. The SPD, on the other hand, although they only nudged ahead of the CDU-CSU, they're doing a lot better than a lot of people had predicted only 6 months ago. So the feeling at the moment is that we're probably headed for a coalition led by Mr. Scholz, but as I say, a long way to go. So
just to make it even more simple for those people who don't follow very closely, the best result was the SPD, which did better than expected and pipped the CDU second. And then just go quickly explain the good showing, the very good showing of the FDP and the Greens.
Yeah, so these are the two smaller parties that will almost certainly make up the numbers in the next coalition. The Green Party got about 15% of the vote. That felt very disappointing because just a few months ago, they briefly led in the polls. But to draw the camera back a little bit, and this is a good result for the Green Party. It's by a long way the best result in their history. They're going to play a very important role in the next government. They'll have control of a lot of key ministries, and they will shape the priorities of the next coalition to a certain extent. The next party to look at is the Free Democrats, a smaller sort of pro-business liberal party. They got about 11% of the vote, pretty much flat on 2017. But because of the fragmentation of the political landscape, they are also likely to be a crucial part of the next government. And one of the most interesting things that happened last night after the results started to come in is that these two parties, the junior partners in the next coalition, the Greens and the FDP, declared that they wanted to come to terms with each other first because they disagree on an awful lot, and then take a proposition to one of the two bigger parties. So in effect, what they want to do is to become joint kingmakers for the next government.
Thank you. Jörg, so Tom has laid out for us exactly what happened. Why don't you give us your sense, watching there from Hamburg, what were for you the big surprises last night?
Well, thank you for having me. Tom just pointed out, I think, the biggest change, and that is that these two smaller parties will be kingmakers. And we're facing a fragmented party landscape. I mean, the bigger parties have shrunk. This is in line with developments all over Europe or all over most liberal democracies. But this is actually the most exciting new development is the Greens and the FDP being kingmakers in any of the possible two three-way coalitions that I can foresee. One of them being the so-called traffic light coalition led by Olaf Scholz, the winner from the center-left Social Democratic Party. The other, the so-called Jamaica coalition led by Armin Laschet, the center-right candidate. In both of these coalitions, these two parties will be the drivers.
I mean, that is for those of you who don't follow or haven't followed German politics that closely, an extraordinary shift. For most of post-war history, German politics was dominated really by the centre left and the centre right, by the SPD and the CDU. And now these two other parties, the FDP, the Free Democrats, and the Greens, have really, as you say, Jörg, become kingmakers and are far more popular than the traditional parties amongst younger voters. And that is a kind of sea change in German politics that's been coming. Tom, perhaps you could, and we could have our election model results put up, because we built for the first time an election prediction model, which gives you a sense of these parties. And Tom, tell us, how did our model do? And there you can see the different results of them. And then we'll come on to the bottom two parties in a second.
So I've had a word with our data guru, Elliot Morris, in America, who helped build this model, who is fairly bullish on its performance. I've been taking a little bit of grief on social media today because we, before the polls closed, we predicted, or our model predicted, or it gave the CDU-CSU a 2/3 chance, 2 in 3 chance of becoming the largest party, even though they had been in the polls for several weeks, but behind in the polls for several weeks by that point. And the argument is that we sort of swung the wheel a little bit too far towards the CDU-CSU. We were too bullish on the union. But I'm told that other polling models were too bearish on the union, and that their bearishness, in most cases, exceeded our bullishness. The problem that our bullishness led us to make a prediction that put the CDU-CSU on the wrong side of the SPD. Of course, they came second, although it was a very small margin. And as you can see on this nicely put together chart, the confidence intervals were very wide. And just one other thing to add to that, I think, is that although we may have the call on which party was going to come first may not have been right, we did a bit better when it came to forecasting which coalitions were going to be plausible. We said that a grand coalition, the SPD and the CDU-CSU together, were likely to have a majority. And we said that a left-wing coalition that would put together the SPD, the Greens, and the Left Party that you can see at the bottom of the chart there, this was a sort of a bogeyman hanging over the campaign for several weeks. We said that only had a 1 in 4 chance of securing a majority. And that was a good call, because these three parties together, in fact, have fallen short of a majority, largely because the left had a terrible night. So, I think all in all, it wasn't too bad. There's probably a few things to learn from it. We've never done it before. I don't think anybody else has done it before. We've got some things right, some things not so right.
I want to talk a little bit about the bottom two parties, the AfD and the left. And we have a question from Brian, who is watching this, who asks, what do you make of the AfD performance? What does it mean for other extreme right-wing European parties? Jörg, I'm going to give that one to you. What do you make of the AfD?
They will not play a part in any kind of coalition, because the CDU drew the line there. There will not even be talks with them. They performed reasonably well for their expectations all over Germany. The most important thing about their performance is the way they scored in Saxonia and Thuringia, two former East German parts of the Bundesrepublik. And they have managed to become the strongest party there, and I think it's mostly due to the weakness of the CDU, because you can't find this in other Eastern German Länder. So it's especially where the center right is weakest that they can thrive. That's
But it
my
does
takeaway.
perhaps as though we've reached a ceiling for where these extreme right wing parties are going. Tom, you're nodding. Do you agree with
Yeah.
me? Is that an upbeat message?
Yeah, I think there's something really interesting to point out here. And it's interesting to compare Germany to other European countries because we've already mentioned the fragmentation. The two traditional people's parties, the Union and the SPD, they got yesterday around about half of the vote. And that number has been going down and down and down and down over the years, as it has done in other countries. So that's political fragmentation. We're going to need three parties to put together a coalition. That complicates things. But I think and that's a common story across Europe, but I think what's different in Germany is that fragmentation has not come at the expense of the political centre, considered in its broadest sense. So we've already spoken about how the FDP and particularly the Green Party did well. The share of seats that the extremist parties, if you want to call them that, the AfD on the right and Die Linke on the left, the share of seats that they will have in the Bundestag has shrunk. They had about 22% after the last election. They will now have 15%, and the centre, therefore, has risen. So what you see is a strengthening of the political centre in Germany, despite the fragmentation. And that, I think, is a distinct German story that you don't necessarily find in other European countries that have experienced political fragmentation.
That's really interesting. Let's talk a bit about these new parties at the centre, as you put it. So we have the Greens and the FDP, who are collectively the kingmakers. They will be almost certainly in either coalition. So they will either go with Olaf Scholz and the SPD in the traffic light coalition, named Red, Yellow, Green, or they will go with Armin Laschet and the CDU in the Jamaica coalition. Now, that suggests that they just need to decide which to go with. But I think it glosses over the fact that there are fairly fundamental disagreements amongst the Greens and the FDP. There are important areas where they're on very, very different ground. And Jörg, perhaps you could explain to our listeners those disagreements.
Sure. I mean, you have the business-friendly debt talks of the FDP, classical neoliberal party, and then you have the Greens who want to see government invest much more, especially in climate-friendly ways, and then you have the whole issue about rules and regulations and the role of the government. They have very different ideas about the scope and the role of the government. So they have to come together so as not to be played against each other by the two bigger partners that they have to join to form a coalition. So that was a very smart move, I think, by Christian Lindner, the head of the Liberal Party, yesterday evening, announcing that there would be preliminary talks between the two smaller parties before they begin negotiations with the bigger parties, so as not to be played against each other. So that's a really new development that we haven't seen before, because they come from different milieus. The people who vote for them don't especially like each other. So there is a lot to be overcome there.
So, Tom, the possibility of power can make strange bedfellows, but I'm just trying to imagine what these negotiations are going to be like. Raphael, one of our viewers, asks us, how can you possibly bridge the interest of the Greens and the FDP? How can the climate-focused crowd and the free market crowd, if you will. I mean, I like to think that there's, coming from The Economist, that there's no tension here. You can be both green and free market. But other than reading our pages, what do you think they're going to be talking about?
Well, I have good news for you, Zanny, which is that I think they're ultimately, at the end of the day, they may well be able to find a way to bridge their differences and to find a market-friendly way to help Germany meet its climate goals. I think the starting point here is that both of these parties are very, very keen to enter government. It's been a long time since either of them were in power, particularly the Green Party. And the second thing to note is that actually for several weeks before the election, you could see these parties, and in particular Christian Lindner and the Free Democrats, preparing the ground, because it was pretty clear that they were likely to have to figure out a way to bridge their differences so that they could enter coalition together. And it's interesting to look at the red lines that they set out in coalition negotiations, because on the surface, it looks pretty tricky. So, for example, the FDP says there can be no tampering with the debt brake in Germany's constitution, which limits deficit spending. There can be no tax rises on the rich. There can be no amendment to the fiscal rules of the European Union. And these are all things that the Green Party wants to do. But they're not red lines for the Green Party. What the Green Party really wants to do is to have a big program of public and private investment to do things like expand electricity grids, renewables, electric car infrastructure, all of this stuff to help speed the climate transition. And there are ways to do that without simply racking up giant amounts of public debt, which is what the FDP are unhappy about. And I won't bore viewers with too many details, but you can basically establish off-budget vehicles to do this sort of thing, probably devoted to particular investment needs. That is something that the FDP specifically has not ruled out. It's something that the Green Party will very clearly get behind if that's where the kind of political landing ground is. It's a bit messy. It's not particularly democratic, but that's how it works in coalition negotiations, where everybody has to swallow something difficult. And I think, to go back to where I started, the fact that both of these parties are so keen to enter government, they have such a hunger for power, means that there will be a strong drive to overcome these very real differences.
So we'll delve into that in a little more detail in a second. But first, a couple of really interesting questions about what is not happening. So Niels asks, why not just continue the Grand Coalition? Is that a no-go? And if so, why? That's a question first for you, Jörg.
Yeah, it's a no-go. These two parties have been in coalitions for so many years, and they've both shrunk to this dismal level. They don't want to continue this. And I can only imagine this coming up as a last resort if all these talks that we're going to see now over weeks and weeks and months maybe come to nothing. Then this would be a desperate solution to this problem, to this riddle of the new political situation in Germany, but nobody actually wants it.
And we also have several people asking, is minority government an option? Jörg, another question for you.
I don't think so. What we're going to see is going to be inherently unstable. It's never been done before in Germany, but a minority government would be even more unstable. And it's also something none of the bigger players actually want to do. So I don't think it's a possibility.
Okay, so we are likely to see the two kingmaker parties either with the SPD then or with the CDU. So we'll delve into that in a little more detail in a second. But first, a couple of really interesting questions about what is not happening, or about characters and who's going to lead. So maybe, Jörg, let's start with you, because Olaf Scholz, who is the Chancellor candidate of the SPD and thus currently the man tipped to be the most likely next chancellor. He was the mayor of Hamburg, where you are. Give us a quick pen portrait. You know him. What's he like?
Yeah, he's a pretty typical Hamburg guy, pretty
What
dry.
does that mean?
Yeah, it's got a pretty dry sense of humor, almost a little, well, close to the British, I would say, at least if you compare it to southern parts of Germany. He's a very calm, rational guy. He likes to present himself as the safe pair of hands. And in the social democratic spectrum, he's someone who was a reformist with Gerhard Schröder, very much in favor of the reforms of the welfare state that were not popular with social democrats. And he's come a long way in embracing a little bit more of a left-wing agenda, but still presenting it in a very rational, calm way, so as not to scare off any voters.
So that is Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor candidate of the Social Democratic Party. Now, Tom, why don't you tell us about Armin Laschet, who is the man who would become Chancellor if the Christian Democrats, and that is, of course, the party of Angela Merkel, were to manage to pull off a coalition?
So Armin Laschet is the minister president of North Rhine-Westphalia. It's a little bit like an American state governor. North Rhine-Westphalia, the most populous state in Germany, about 18 million residents, about the same size as the Netherlands. So this is a pretty big job. He's from the town of Aachen in the far west of Germany, about as far west as you can get near the Dutch and Belgian borders. And he's a sort of a typical Rhinelander. So he's sort of jovial. He likes a drink. He loves carnival, which is sort of crucial importance to this part of Germany. And when he won that election in North Rhine-Westphalia 4 years ago, that instantly catapulted him into one of the CDU's big beasts. You know, he was the biggest of the state premiers, and he was clearly going to have a big role in the future of the party. I think one of the difficulties that he's had is convincing a lot of the party, and in particular its sister party, the Christian Social Union, which operates only in Bavaria, in convincing these guys that he was the right person to lead their first post-Merkel election campaign. And there was a very intense incident in April when the CDU-CSU had to choose whether it was going to be Mr. Laschet or Markus Söder, who's the head of the Bavarian party, the CSU, which one of them was going to lead the campaign. And it came down to this crunch meeting in the Bundestag in Wolfgang Schäuble's office, in which one after another CDU MP stood up and said, Mr. Laschet, you're going to lead us into catastrophe, to his face. But nevertheless, he prevailed, largely thanks to Wolfgang Schäuble, who's one of the grand old men of the CDU. And now I think there's a strong feeling in large parts of the CDU, certainly in the CSU, that was the moment it all went wrong. That was when they made the wrong choice. And that's why they've had such a disastrous election result.
So this, for those of you who don't follow German politics, and it is incredibly complicated, even for those of us who do follow it reasonably closely, these are the two most likely people to succeed Angela Merkel. It'll either be Olaf Scholz from the SPD, the Social Democrats, or Armin Laschet from the CDU. But we have these two smaller parties that we've been discussing, the Free Democrats, which is the pro-business Liberal Party, and the Greens. Their leaders will be kingmakers, but they won't aspire to be chancellor. But they will, however, be aspiring to get plum positions in the coalition. So, Tom, can you give us a bit of a pen portrait of Christian Lindner, the head of the Free Democrats, and what kind of job he might be angling for?
So Christian Lindner is one of the most fascinating characters in German politics, incredibly divisive, very articulate, extraordinarily ambitious, and basically he wants the finance ministry. And in particular, if we do end up with a so-called traffic light coalition, so the Olaf Scholz as chancellor in the Green Party along with the Liberals, so this is a sort of left-leaning coalition, then Christian Lindner would want the finance ministry basically as a sort of a perch from which he could act as a kind of a brake on the spending plans, investment plans of the Social Democrats and the Greens. And this would be his way of justifying to his own party base, who will be quite skeptical about entering a coalition of this sort. He will be able to say, don't worry, I will be able to stop them from doing all of these crazy things, from racking up debts, from sending all of your hard-earned taxpayers' money to those Southern Europeans. I mean, that would be a rather nice position for him to have. It's not necessarily going to be very easy for the other parties to swallow that, but that's the sort of thing that is going to have to be figured out in the course of these very complex negotiations. So Christian Lindner, at the moment, is in a very strong position to land himself an extremely plum post in the next government, I think.
Thank you. And last, Jörg, why don't you tell us about Annalena Baerbock, who was the Chancellor candidate for the Green Party? What will she and what will the Greens be pushing for as positions in any coalition?
I would guess that she pushes for foreign minister, because it's what she most cares about and where she is kind of an expert. She has focused a lot on foreign issues, on international issues, apart from climate change, obviously, and that could be a very suitable job for her. Interestingly, the Greens, while being on the somewhat left of center, are pretty tough on some foreign policy issues like how to address Russia and China and authoritarianism. For Germans, they almost seem sometimes like a little bit of a neocon um, program. So that might be very interesting in this new coalition that we're talking about. This element of a tougher, more NATO-oriented foreign policy, especially driven by the Greens.
That's really interesting, and we'll come to that as we look forward to see where Germany might be after this election. But just one more question on the mechanics, which is you've both spoken about months of negotiations. Is there a time limit? Several viewers are asking, and how long do you predict this will go on for? Tom?
It's really, really difficult to say. I mean, the answer to the first question is no. There is no time limit. There's nothing in the Constitution. There's no point at which a new chancellor has to be appointed. The talks will go on as long as they need to. And everybody here remembers 2017, where the first attempt to put together a coalition, also a Jamaica coalition under Angela Merkel, fell apart when Christian Lindner walked out of those talks, and they had to start from scratch, put together a grand coalition. And by the time we had a new government in place, I think it was about 6 months after the election. So this could go on for a long time. We did hear from Olaf Scholz last night that he would hope that a new government would be in place by the end of the year, by Christmas. But I mean, this is nothing more than an aspiration. And I think the only thing that's going to determine how long it takes is how long it takes.
For those of our viewers from the United States, it sometimes seems to me that American elections are interminable in the build-up to the election. You know, it's months and months and months. German elections go on forever afterwards. So hopefully by Christmas there will be a coalition government. And just Angela Merkel will be there as a caretaker chancellor until such time as there is a new government. If you'd like to read more about the ins and outs of the German election system, you can read our explainer, which is coming up on the QR code here, which I recommend because it is profoundly complicated. Let's now turn to what these results mean, both for Germany and then for Europe and the rest of us. And I know it's very early days. We don't even know the exact shape of the coalition, but you have both brought up the sort of tensions between what are likely to be the constituent parties. What areas is this going to play out on? Tom, you know, what were the big domestic themes of this election?
Well, I mean, the simple answer to that is that there weren't any, because the campaign was about personalities, it was about parties, it was kind of about itself. The slightly less flippant answer is that if this election was about anything at all, at least in terms of policy, climate was certainly close to the top of the list. And in some of the TV debates between the leading candidates, you did actually have a fairly rich debate. Not about whether Germany ought to be acting quickly to meet its climate targets, because these are now set down in law, both domestic and European law, but about how it ought to do that. You know, that to what extent it ought to rely on market mechanisms like a carbon price versus government diktat and regulation, banning coal at an earlier date, or the combustion engine. So this stuff, I think it's a pretty safe bet that in the coalition negotiations that lie ahead of us, getting this stuff nailed down is going to be at the absolute heart of the coalition negotiations. A second theme, perhaps less to the forefront, but it was there, was a sort of a cluster of issues around taxation, spending, welfare, social justice. I think we mentioned earlier that the FDP have it as a red line that there will be no tax rises in the next government. Both the SPD and the Greens want to do things like introduce a wealth tax, have a more progressive income tax system. They might want to tinker with inheritance tax. These are the sort of things that I think might fall by the wayside in coalition talks with the FDP, but they are the sort of things that people are thinking about. Foreign policy, I'm sorry to say, played next to no role at all in the campaign. That includes European policy. That's not only a bit dispiriting as an observer of the campaign, it's also problematic because it's very clear that one way or another the next government is going to have to confront a whole raft of issues at the European level, at the international level, and whatever government emerges is basically going to have no mandate to do that because it wasn't something that was discussed during the campaign.
Well, we won't let the fact that it wasn't discussed in the campaign stop us, since we have the foreign editor of Die Zeit here. But we'll come on to foreign policy in a second. Jörg, I just want to stick a little bit longer with domestic policy, which is, Tom has painted a rather, and I think it's probably accurate, but a rather depressing picture of a of a somewhat superficial campaign that was basically about nothing very much. But why do you think, when people who went to the polls yesterday, what were they voting about? What was the issue or issues that you think mattered most to people?
I think in surveys we've seen that climate matters a lot to people. That's at least what they say. When it actually comes down to their decision, I think they voted about who's going to lead this country going forward from after these 16 years that we've just we're going to leave behind. And actually, one of the things that you can take away is that they trusted none of the three contenders alone to be this kind of leader. So they shrunk the big parties and they grew the small parties, and now they have to find a way to build a coalition from this mix of ideologies and of programs that we've just been talking about. That's, I think, the task that the electorate has set.
Them. We have a number of very specific and interesting questions on one aspect of this, which is the climate aspect. Trevor asks, will there be a fresh look at the advantages of nuclear energy? As you know, many of you, that was no. Chancellor Merkel's
clear no, but I don't know about you, Tom, but no.
Yes, the answer is no, but it was quite interesting in the last week or two of the campaign. Armin Laschet, for reasons known only to himself, started to say that it was a mistake to start to phase out nuclear power. Angela Merkel made that decision in 2011 after the Fukushima disaster. Laschet said that it was a mistake to do that before thinking about how they're going to phase out coal. This is an odd thing to do. I mean, he's right. I think we at The Economist and plenty of others think that the decision to phase out nuclear power was the wrong one, and it makes it more difficult for Germany to meet its climate targets. But it was an odd thing to choose to bring up in the closing stages of the campaign, particularly when there is an almost universal consensus in the German political class that nuclear power is a thing of the past. The only party that actually has it in their platform that they want to see a return to nuclear power is the hard right AfD. And I think that tells you quite a lot about the role that nuclear power plays in the German political debate.
Okay, so no fresh look at nuclear, but what about in practice? Will there actually be an effective change in policies towards the climate? Karen asks this. Will there actually be a meaningful change? Yes or no, Jörg?
I think so. It's all parties have been running on this topic, and it's not just the programs. It's we've had firsthand experience with climate disasters in this country in June. And I can speak for myself here. My home village is gone in the floods that have devastated parts of Western Germany. This has driven home the urgency of climate policies. And then it's not just that, it's decarbonizing German industry is the task for this government and maybe the next. So I think there will be changes, and the so-called traffic light coalition that we talk about is positioned quite well to tackle these issues, exactly because they bring in such a diverse group of politicians from different walks from different sides of the aisle.
I'm very sorry to hear about your home village. I mean, we were struck watching that, both how devastating it was, but also how it appeared not to make a huge difference in the polling really relatively soon thereafter. So I'm interested that you think it really did cut through, and that will be an area where we will see substantial change in German policy.
Yeah, I think it could have played a bigger role, but there were so many blunders by the Green Party. It sounds cynical, but it was a gift to them, basically, this event. And they didn't use it because the candidate, Annalena Baerbock, had a lot of gaffes and blunders. And but I think it's very much in the minds of many people. especially young people. And the Greens polling so well with young people tells you something about how pressing they see this issue.
Tom, a
Xander, can
question.
I add?
Go, jump, go, you go in.
So very quickly, just an extra thing on the climate, which I think is really important, which is a few months ago, there was a shock ruling by Germany's constitutional court that said that Germany's climate law was insufficient because it did not sufficiently take into account the rights of future generations. And this was fascinating, not only because it obliged the government almost instantly to rewrite its climate targets and to make them much tighter, but also because it was the reasoning was innovative. It showed that the court was thinking about climate in a completely new way. And now, whatever the next government is, whenever it's thinking about what it needs to do in order to meet Germany's climate targets, it will always have that ruling at the back of its mind. It will know that if it doesn't do enough to make meeting those targets realistic, it might face another ruling from that court, and it might have to change the law again. So I think that was a really important development for the future of Germany's climate policy.
And one more question on this before we turn to the international implications of all of this, which we've had several questions about the demographic breakdown of the vote and particularly the implications of the youth vote. Tom, could you just lay out the surprises of the youth vote and what you think the ongoing consequences of that will be? Because it was quite striking.
Yeah, I mean, if you do a graph and sort of break it down from young to old, then what you see a kind of a fairly straightforward pattern, which is that the smaller parties of the centre, the Free Democrats and the Greens, did best amongst younger voters. I think they were placed first and second. And then as you go sort of up the ladder towards the older age groups, you find that the more, as it were, traditional parties, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, did better and better and better. And in fact, I think one of the most decisive swings in the vote in this election was amongst older voters away from Armin Laschet's Christian Democrats and towards the Social Democrats. He was able to give older voters a sense that he was the rightful heir to Angela Merkel rather than Armin Laschet. What does that mean for the future? Well, who knows? I mean, one of the questions will be whether those sorts of voting habits stick around as voters age, or whether they will sort of age into the more traditional parties, as it were. I think that there's good reason to think that, at least to a certain extent, the habits that they've demonstrated at this election will persist. The fragmentation of the larger parties, as we were saying earlier, is clearly a long-term shift. I think it's going to continue. It may not be entirely predictable, but I think probably the future of Germany's political landscape is a yet more fragmented one, a yet more complicated one, and that will partly be driven by those very big, stark differences that you see in voting behaviour between younger and older voters.
Thank you. We have lots more questions on the domestic consequences, but I am conscious of the time, so I'd like to turn now to the international implications of this vote. I mean, Angela Merkel, 16 years as Chancellor, I venture to say is by far the best known European politician. She's, outlasted American presidents, British prime ministers, French presidents. She is, we called her the indispensable European on our cover a few years ago. In the post-Merkel era, which is the one we're going to now, what will change in terms of Germany's role in the world? Can we glean anything from the results yesterday? And Jörg, I'm going to start with you because you pointed to some very interesting shifts in the policy of some of the constituent parties in a future coalition. So where do you expect to see significant change in Germany's position, if anywhere?
Well, one factor is that the next chancellor, whoever it will be a somewhat weaker figure than Mrs. Merkel. From everything we just pointed out, the more fragmented political landscape, the three-way coalition. So this might mean that the bargaining power of Germany on the European stage might also be somewhat diminished. And there are already speculations in the European press who is going to be the strong figure for the next decade or next foreseeable next years in Europe. Is it going to be Macron? Is it going to be Draghi? This was not discussed during Angela Merkel's years. She was obviously the strongest politician in Europe, and I I would think it's going to be, Europe is going to be a bit more multi-centered. And yeah, in this coalition, if we get a green foreign minister and a social democratic chancellor, we might have a very interesting tension. I just pointed out that the Greens have somewhat tougher positions on Russia and China. They were very, very critical about Nord Stream 2, the pipeline connecting Germany to Russia's gas. And Olaf Scholz and also Armin Laschet were very, very supportive of this project. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out, this internal tension in the new government.
That's really interesting. Tom, what's your take on that? I mean, at some level, it suggests, it could all be rather incoherent, right? You've got both the SDP, the Social Democrats, and the Christian Democrats. So the main parties in either coalition are pro Nord Stream, are pro the continuing of the Merkel position, but actually the smaller parties are much more hawkish, if you will. Where is Germany going to end up, in your view, vis-a-vis Russia and then vis-a-vis China?
Yes, I mean, rather big questions. I think Nord Stream itself, I think, is probably more or less a done deal in the sense that the Germans and the Americans did a deal on this a few months ago, which has sort of settled at least the transatlantic politics of this, and the pipeline is completed and gas will probably start to flow through it. But on the bigger questions, Russia, I think, is really a kind of a problem to be managed, something to be contained. Angela Merkel held together the EU, which imposed sanctions on Russia after its annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine a few years ago. And those sanctions have held ever since. I see no reason for the next chancellor, whoever it is, to change course on that. Although we have had some slightly worrying signs from Armin Laschet over the years of more sympathy towards the Kremlin than some in Germany and some outside observers might like. But I think broadly that course will stick. To a certain extent, the kind of deterrence posture towards Russia inside Europe is something that Germans can be relatively comfortable with. It's certainly something that they're familiar with. The Chinese question, I think, is much more complicated and probably in the long run much more important. Angela Merkel, of course, throughout her time as Chancellor, had an engagement first policy with China. I think she was fascinated by its rise. She's sometimes accused of just being a mercantilist, subjecting German foreign policy to its trading relationship with China. Certainly German exporters did very well out of the rise of China, but I think there was more to the Merkel line than mercantilism. I think what she wanted to do, and it was a reasonable thing to want, was to figure out a way to fold China into the multilateral system. She didn't think that you could contain China's rise, but I think that she thought that there was a role for Germany in trying to manage it. Now that line has come under increasing criticism inside Germany and of course outside Germany in recent years. And I think there's now a consensus, at least in some parts of the German establishment, that this relationship with China is going to have to be recalibrated on almost every single front. And interestingly, a lot of this is coming from German business, which is seeing the relationship with China sour. A lot of it is coming from the fact that we're obviously entering an era of great power competition between America and China, in which Europe is caught in the middle. And of course, that competition is not just taking place in the military domain, where Germany is always reluctant to play a part, but it covers things like trade, like technology, like diplomacy with third parties. Now, these are all things that Germany is not in a position to stay out of. You have seen some sort of gestures towards taking this seriously in the last couple of years, but I think it's going to become a much more pressing concern for the next chancellor, not because they will want it to be, but because events will force it on them. I think this will be the biggest foreign policy test for the next German government.
That's really interesting. Jörg, what's your take on that? I'm sure Tom is right that China is going to be the single biggest challenge for the next German chancellor, frankly, as it is for every Western country right now. So what will shift in Germany's position? Do either of the Olaf Scholz or Armin Laschet share Angela Merkel's sort of view of needing to deal with China's rise? Are they do they have a similarly? I think she had a largely, or has a largely admiring view of much of what China is trying to do. Do they share that, or how will things change?
I don't know about the admiration, but they share the the approach of engagement first, just as Tom pointed out. But it will be very interesting to see if there will be an internal debate about this in this new coalition, and that's why I'm not totally hopeless about this result, because I like the idea that the Greens as well as the FDP share a more critical stance on human rights abuses, but also on unfair trading practices in China, and they want to address this more openly. And they might, as Tom just pointed out, find alliances in the business community where people also think something has to be done. This can't go on the way we did business so many years. And then there's the international factor here, and Tom just pointed it out. There's a lot of pressure on Germany from the US side to take sides more openly in this big geopolitical competition. And it's difficult for Germany because decoupling is not an option for the German industry. It's just not feasible for Germany. But a more open and more outspoken approach towards all these issues is needed. And so we'll see how they navigate these difficult issues.
Just one sort of practical question, because the interesting thing about German coalition agreements is that they're incredibly detailed, and the parties lay out what their view is on all kinds of policy matters, and they lay out, specific tax policies, spending policies, all manner of things. But the problem with foreign policy is that events happen. The Americans leave Afghanistan at short notice. Something happens. And you can't presumably write a coalition agreement that foresees every possible thing that could happen in the next few years. So much must depend on what your assessment is of the sort of combined instinct. So do you think an Olaf Scholz-led coalition or an Armin Laschet-led coalition, which one would be more hawkish, both on Russia and on China? Tom?
I think that's exactly the right question to ask. As you say, these coalition treaties are very, very detailed, but you can't do that with foreign policy. One of the questions will be, under Angela Merkel, foreign policy was concentrated inside the Chancellery, including European policy. And the current foreign minister, Heiko Maas, was extraordinarily weak and not particularly competent. It's not necessarily the case that the next chancellor will want to continue that line. If Jörg is right and Annalena Baerbock becomes the next foreign minister, with perhaps Olaf Scholz as chancellor, perhaps he will be happy to see the foreign ministry regain some of the authority that it once had, and then becomes a more interesting question. But if we're comparing these two men, Olaf Scholz and Armin Laschet, if we want to sort of think about it on a hawkish, dovish spectrum, certainly I think you'd expect to find, at least in the initial period, Armin Laschet, who comes from a background of running a state with strong industrial interests, particularly strong relationships with China, I think to continue a sort of a Merkel line of relative dovishness. Olaf Scholz, I don't think you'd see him coming out all guns blazing, but I think you might expect him to take a more sort of realistic approach. And he does, Olaf Scholz doesn't have extensive international experience, but he does have a few feathers in his cap. He was instrumental in putting together the global corporate tax agreement that we saw earlier this year. Got a lot of European experience. Was a key architect in the recovery fund that Germany and France agreed last year. And I think just generally, probably you can imagine him going mano a mano with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping a little bit more easily than you can Armin Laschet, I think.
So, Jörg, do you agree with that? And one additional one for you, which one of the two of them will get on better with President Joe Biden?
I guess Olaf Scholz would be the easier partner for Joe Biden.
Hello, centre-left politician.
Yeah. But I think there is a lot of rethinking has to be done on the part of the Social Democrats about their concept of engagement coming from the old idea of Ostpolitik, from the Cold War, change through trade. they stick to these ideas a little bit. I think there's a little bit of naivete that they will have to lose once they're in charge. I mean, look at China. We just discussed it. We have a lot of trade with China. We've never been closer with China than today in terms of trade, but it hasn't amounted to a lot of opening up of the Chinese society. Quite to the contrary. That's the riddle of the Xi Jinping era, and the Social Democrats will have to come to terms with that old style Ostpolitik doesn't work with China. So this is also going to be interesting to watch, I guess.
Very good point. And I will stick my neck out there. And I think that this area is one area where it will take a while, but German policy will change really quite substantially towards China in the next few years, in large part because of what is happening in China and how Germany is realizing what is happening in China. We have only a few minutes left, and I don't think we can end an hour conversation about Germany without talking a little bit about Angela Merkel's own legacy. And Tom, I'm going to start with you because you've just written a long special report for us this week, which I thoroughly recommend, of course. It's a really excellent special report about Germany after Merkel. But in briefly, considerably more briefly than your very good special report, give us a sense of what you think her legacy will be.
So the funny thing about Angela Merkel is that while she's clearly a political giant and an extraordinary figure in many ways, it's quite difficult to figure out exactly what her legacy is. You look back at 16 years in charge of Germany and in a sense, in charge of Europe, and it's difficult to point to any sort of far-reaching decisions that were taken outside of the context of crises. I was based in Brussels for 4 years. We went through endless crises then, Eurozone, Russia, Ukraine, Brexit, refugees, and each one of them you found Angela Merkel at the heart of things, thrashing out a deal, forging very deep personal relationships with the people that she needed to get things done. But you saw very little of the sort of Emmanuel Macron, we have to make Europe tougher, we have to make it more resilient, more autonomous. That was not her way of doing things. So I think the Merkel legacy is probably going to be not so much one of policy decisions or ideology, but more one of sort of method. And the method is of waiting till the last possible minute to make a decision, making sure that you bring all of the relevant stakeholders along with you, so that you don't have fractures either inside Europe or inside the German system, and taking sort of a managerial approach to problems rather than fixing them according to any sort of pre-existing vision. And that has definitely had its advantages. I mean, back in 2010, 2011, all sorts of people were predicting that the Eurozone was going to fall apart. It didn't, and I think that's in large part due to Angela Merkel. But if you, again, to take the Eurozone crisis, look at some of the decisions that were taken at that time, and they were very, very damaging, particularly for countries in Southern Europe, the entrenching of the kind of sort of fiscal indiscipline as a narrative and the austerity that followed from it. And that was basically because the only way that she could see to navigate through her own domestic politics in the European situation was to take that kind of approach and, to hell with the consequences. So it's a mixed legacy, I think. And the argument of the special report is that Germany, under whichever government leads it next, is going to have to confront a whole raft of challenges, from the economic, industrial, demographic to the security and diplomatic, that Angela Merkel has not left it in particularly good shape to manage. So it could be a rough decade for the next it could be a rough next decade for Germany. And that's partly because of Angela Merkel not doing enough to prepare the country for those challenges.
I want to now turn, Jörg, to you, and actually just ask you very specifically, what would you say was the single best thing that Chancellor Merkel has done in her 16 years, and what was the single worst thing?
The refugee crisis. I think one of the best things she did was not to close the border and to bring in these almost over 1 million refugees. And the worst thing she did was not to say, this is temporary, people. We're not giving up control over the border, and thereby making the AfD bigger than they should be, creating a lot of backlash also in our neighborhood, giving Viktor Orban a big stage to become a leading figure. So it was in the same instance that I think her best and her worst showed.
That's a
in
great way of
2015.
answering the question that Charles, actually, one of our viewers, has asked exactly that question, and you've answered it both, that it was the single best and single worst thing that she did. I love the way you framed that. Tom, what would you think? Single best and single worst?
Well, for the best, I think again I would sort of think about methods rather than decisions. I mean, what she did and what she particularly came to represent in an era, especially in the last 5 years, of sort of growing populism, nationalism, authoritarian strongmen all over the world, including in Europe. Angela Merkel was the antithesis of that: calm, anti-populist, resolutely liberal, methodical. And that's why I think you had this sort of funny moment when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, where desperate Americans in particular would say things like Angela Merkel is now the leader of the free world. Which I don't think there was anybody who found that a more absurd proposition than Angela Merkel herself, but it told you something about the way in which she almost became a kind of a life raft for people who were very scared about what was happening to their countries. As for the worst decision, wow. Well, I mean, I've already spoken about it, but I think it's quite difficult to look at some of the decisions that were made at European level with strong German backing in the Eurozone crisis, and to think that was handled as well as it possibly could have been. It's very clear, looking back at the bailouts for Greece and for other countries, that the cost of managing that crisis was considerably higher than it needed to be, that some terrible decisions were made about the appropriate balance between correcting imbalances in fiscal policy and ensuring that countries didn't have to suffer unduly for mistakes that were made by politicians. And Angela Merkel was not only behind some of those decisions, she helped shape them. That's not a particularly comfortable legacy. It's something that a lot of us have forgotten about. And I'm very happy to say that Europe, particularly in the way that it's managed the response to the pandemic, on the fiscal and on the monetary front, has taken a much more rational approach to that than it did in the past. But those decisions, I think, caused a lot of undue suffering. And that shouldn't be forgotten when we're considering Angela Merkel's overall record.
So thank you, Tom. I encourage all of you to read Tom's very even-handed and excellent assessment of the legacy that Angela Merkel leaves behind. It is easy, I think, to take for granted the contribution that her calm crisis management skills, her seriousness, her competence made to European stability in the last few years. But I guess my final 2 cents worth would be that they bred in Germany a complacency. There haven't been any reforms domestic of note in Germany for almost 20 years now. And they probably bred a complacency in German politics. And I possibly would go as far as to say in much of Europe. It's sort of the stability is taken for granted. And as a result, as Tom says, the to-do list is long. And we are living in a really quite dangerous, fast-changing world with the tensions between the US and China. And this is something that there are calls for from Anglo-Saxons all the time, but the need for Germany to play a leadership role is really there. But we're going to have to wait several months until we find out who the characters are who will be doing that. So with that, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Jörg. Thank you, Tom. I hope we've answered some of your questions. We haven't answered all of them, but please head to subscriberevents.economist.com to find out about other subscriber events. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. There you can also find information on previous discussions, including an event on the decisive decade for climate change.